Mecha anime has always been quite a favorite genre of mine, and seeing as I own quite a bit of these shows and films on DVD, it only makes sense. And since my early days of anime watching, well, it comes as no surprise that a certain show would pop up on my radar, and that would of course be the ever-classic and iconic Neon Genesis Evangelion. As made by Studio Gainax and directed by Hideaki Anno, while he was dealing with some very tough depression, it's filled with some dark and depressing characters, insane setting, and just throwing a lot of, well, random nonsense in the audience's face for them to make sense of. And without further ado, I'm going to give you my review of that show, as well as its infamous film conclusion, The End of Evangelion. So, without further ado, let's go. 14 years after the cataclysmic event known as the Second Impact, the world is more or less rebuilding itself. And within Tokyo 3, lays the mysterious and shadowy organization known as NERV, fighting their own battle against the giant monsters known as angels. And to battle these creatures, they have created giant biomachines known as Evangelions. And it's through this that our protagonist Shinji Ikari, who's 14 years old, though that's kind of relevant in the show, has been summoned by his absentee dad Gendo, one of NERV's commanders, to pilot one of these robots. And despite his obvious reluctance in finally reuniting with his dad after several years and then just being asked to pilot a giant robot, he ends up accepting. And it's from this that he struggles and goes through a very, very tough time as this cruel story unfolds. And his relationships with fellow pilots Rei and Asuka and new caretaker Misato, one of NERV's captains, deepens, or perhaps falls apart. Evangelion's plot isn't entirely, well, it doesn't entirely make sense, so to speak. It leaves a lot of things up to interpretation, including its own conclusion, oddly enough. Oh, well, not really oddly, but you get my point. But ultimately, the plot isn't really the most important part of Evangelion, but really, what really drives the plot the most is the characters, because the characters are what really matter. The characters in Evangelion are all pretty three-dimensional and, well, really mentally broken. I mean, to list a few examples, Shinji's pretty whiny and just constantly complaining about his problems, and he's grown up without any real parental figure in his life until Misato comes along and always wants to run away from his troubles. Rei's incredibly emotionless, and even when she's trying to actually learn to, well, show emotion and make relationships with people, there's still far more going on with her behind the scenes than what we really know. And Asuka's, well, she is incredibly rude and abrasive and constantly always spouting about her skill, that when she really just fails, sometimes through no fault of her own, she just keeps blaming everyone around her, especially Shinji, and just pushes everyone away. In fact, pushing everyone away is sort of a theme in this show, really. It's this constant running idea of the hedgehog's dilemma, that human beings can't have relationships with each other because they'll end up hurting one another, just like how two hedgehogs can't get close to each other without, well, their spikes hurting each other. If you get my point. And, well, that's essentially more or less it, because all the relationships in this show are pretty messy. I mean, Shinji and Asuka have this sort of almost respectful relationship going on, and it's sometimes almost romantic, but it usually just evolves into a lot of yelling and pushing away, and Misato and Kaji just have a weirdly sexual thing going on, and it somewhat relates to daddy issues, to put it simplistically, but yeah, that's kind of beside the point. Point is, all these characters are all pretty deep and feel like real human individuals, or human beings really, and that's what really made the show for me. These characters really drive the show, and they really make it what it is. Gainax's animation is nothing particularly special. I mean, it shines when it needs to, especially in most of the angel fights, but this is a show from the late 90s, so it does show its age quite a bit. And, well, if there's anything worth really mentioning about the animation, it's the fact that due to funding cuts among other stuff, the final few episodes had a, well, really lowered down animation quality, to the point where episodes 25 and 26 were made up of nothing but unfinished drawings, still frames, and stock footage. And, well, even these final two episodes don't really conclude everything that's been left off from episode 24, and not really the ideal ending that fans were hoping for. I mean, they more or less resolve all the big character arcs by giving us a big look into everyone's minds and showing us why they act the way they act. And it more or less ends with Shinji deciding that life is worth living and everyone applauds him for it. And, well, it's a good ending in some respect, but from everything that it followed before, it's not particularly perfect. And it's from this that we, well, get the ending that we were all really hoping for, in the form of the movie conclusion, The End of Evangelion. And man, if these last two episodes were insane enough, then this is even worse. The end of Evangelion is a film experience unlike any other that I've really ever witnessed. And that's really saying something. I mean, beyond being more brutally cruel and violent than the series before it, and just containing some of the most insane plot elements and mind-boggling imagery that you may never see elsewhere, it manages to succinctly wrap up all the major plot threads that are left hanging from the show within its 90-minute runtime, and it more or less ends on a note that, well, one could see as bleak and depressing or incredibly hopeful. And for a show full of a lot of ambiguous things, this is more or less a perfect ending for this franchise, and it really works out. But man, that was one hell of a movie to watch. Just pure mind screw. The musical score by Shiro Sagasu is, well, pretty good. I mean, it manages to fit the atmosphere of the show during the darker moments pretty well, and even some of the upbeat songs during the show's early half are pretty catchy too, and overall it's still a pretty damn good score. The English dub, well, the English dub is a really fickle thing. I mean, it came out during the period in the 90s when dubs were slowly sort of getting better. Cowboy Bebop. And, well, it's not consistently great. I mean, due to the fact that ADV were getting like 2 episodes at a time to record, they didn't quite know what they were getting in for when they were doing the dub for the show, and it eventually really picks up by itself in the second half of the show when things really make it into their own. And the performances of Spike Spencer, Alison Keith, and especially Tiffany Grant are just great. And, well, overall it's a dub that I thought was really good, even with all the sort of weaker parts and mistranslations aside. So yeah, it's still a good dub. Neon Genesis Evangelion and The End of Evangelion will always stand amongst my list of favorite anime series and films, and for good reason, from the way each character acts or develops to the interesting and often nonsensical world building, to just the general influence that Hideaki Anno's depression just had on the entire show. It's a unique experience that not everyone will enjoy, and trust me, I've met people who haven't, but it's one that I really liked full-heartedly, and it's one that I recommend you go watch. So, yeah. Both the series and film are unavailable in any English-speaking country so far right now. They were formerly licensed by ADV in America and Mad Men in Australia, but that's completely out of print, and judging by certain rumors online, they probably won't be coming back until the entire Rebuild movies are finished. Or if someone picks up the Blu-ray that was released in Japan last year, but honestly, I don't really know. That stuff's over my head. So yeah. Join me next time when I take a gander at the film remake series that is the Rebuild of Evangelion movies. So, until next time guys, cheerio.